Welcome to the Mindset Nebula. I'm Ethan Jewett, and we have a special episode today that is really just going to be a one-on-one conversation about OData. And joining me today, we've got our OData enthusiast and ABAP expert, API expert, Nick. So Nick, hi, welcome to the Mindset
Hey, thank
Nebula.
you, Ethan. Yeah, thank
This
you
is
so much
not
for
your
inviting
first
me.
time, is it, on the Nebula?
I think it is my first time, to be honest. I
Really?
don't think yeah.
Okay.
So I'm
Long
excited to be
overdue.
part of it. Yeah.
Well, that's excellent. Cool. Well, let's get started. So, I mean, I think most people probably are somewhat familiar with OData who listen to the Nebula, but probably not everybody. So, why don't we start with that? Like,
Yeah.
what is OData? Why do I
Yeah, well,
care?
yeah, exactly. That's an excellent question, right? You've heard on the water cooler people talking about this or other developers, and you're just like, well, I don't know what that is, right? But so to begin with, OData is short for Open Data Protocol. It's basically a standard that's built on top of REST HTTP calls that you can make. So it's an industry standard. So what that means to you and all stuff is that when you call a service that has OData compliant, you know it's going to contain certain features, certain query capabilities, certain functionality across the board. So that's the high
Mhm.
level.
Yeah. So it's sort of it's sort of like a defined REST standard, quite a complicated one.
Yes, yes,
With multiple versions and that kind of thing.
absolutely.
Yeah, but largely compliant with the sort of REST concept, representational state transfer concept, where you're sending back and forth. This is what my sales order looks like. This is what I want. When you want to change something, you send what you want to change. Like you're
Yep,
really kind of sending versions of documents back and forth for the most part. Cool.
absolutely, absolutely.
So, so why would we want to use OData versus just kind of building our own standard? I mean, there is no REST standard, right? But building our
No,
own API that
yep.
does things in a RESTful way, however makes sense to us. Why would we want to use OData?
Absolutely. Yeah. Besides the fact that it's accepted across the board for a lot of places, like it's a standard stuff, right? So your organization builds a new REST service that's using OData. If you give it to another organization, they know when they consume that what functionality and capabilities it will have. Inside the OData standard itself, there's a lot of number of features in there, and we'll go over a high level really quick, but and we'll probably dive here, right, Ethan, in a little bit and talk about some of those. But one thing right I liked about is the metadata call right off the bat, right? So if you're new to the service and all stuff, one of the standard features that come with it is calling this metadata, and what that basically is it defines the service itself, right? So the properties that you have in it, the field types, what fields are available, the keys, navigation routes, and all the entities that are available. So um, like I said, able to
Cool.
query data. So if you're familiar with database languages and all stuff, you know how you can do a where used or sorry, a where condition or filter by columns and all stuff. OData has a lot of query capabilities that allows you to do that too. So um, the list goes on
Cool.
quite a bit. There's quite a bit, but we'll probably dive into it here in
We'll
a
get
little
into
bit.
some of it, yeah. Because what we
Yeah.
want to talk about today is really, we're going to talk a little bit at the beginning here about OData and what it is and why we want to use it. But what we're mostly going to talk about is kind of the hidden features of OData that a lot of
Yep.
developers in the SAP world don't really know about. And it's kind of a shame
Yep.
because there's so much power there
Oh yeah.
that you could leverage. So
Yep.
so tell me a little more about in terms of why we want to use OData. It's big in the SAP ecosystem. It's big in the Microsoft ecosystem. There are a lot of tools that consume it. The other big sort of API descriptor standard, I guess I would say, is Open API, which used to be
Yep.
called Swagger. What's the difference? Like, why would I want to use OData versus Open API? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So Open API is another industry accepted kind of like documentation standard, right? It kind of lays out how that service is defined and stuff too. The metadata call that we talked about a few moments ago is XML. I won't lie, at least for me, I'll be blunt. It's not really readable. It's kind of, not very nice format to read through. Open API really kind of defines a nice readable format. And there are tools available out there that can convert your metadata into this open API standard that you can use in tools like Swagger and all that stuff. Generate YUML diagrams. So if you want to visually see how the entities inside the service are connected, you can do something like that using that open API standard and stuff. So
hmm So Open API is a standard for describing REST APIs, and you
yeah,
can describe an OData API using the Open API standard also, and then use
yes,
all
yep,
those Open API tools to visualize and interact with your OData API,
yep,
which is pretty cool. And we see that actually, right? And like if we go to the API Business Hub, api.sap.com, and we go in and we go to like the API specification, we get into a screen where we can actually build queries against these OData APIs that SAP provides. And that UI is largely generated, it certainly looks to me anyway, like it's
mhm,
generated by these open API generation, documentation generation tools, which is
yep,
pretty cool. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Nice. Great. And I think, I mean, a lot of tools in the SAP ecosystem now are supporting both OData and OpenAPI because OpenAPI is such a prevalent standard outside the SAP ecosystem. So,
Yep.
um, but yeah, but okay, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, OData is more prescriptive, right, about how the
Yeah,
how the API needs to be built, whereas OpenAPI is more about describing
describing it. Yep.
what is this API.
Yep.
Yeah.
And using tools, if you're not familiar with Swagger, I know this is this is a podcast we can't share, but if you're not familiar with that tool, it really does a really nice job in like tools like Swagger where it shows like get, post, patch calls and what they could contain and all that stuff. But we'll get to those
Mhm.
type of CRUD operations later, probably.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it really helps to clarify I mean, OData queries are pretty complicated, and it really helps
Yes,
OpenAPI helps to clarify like what can I do in a query, which is pretty
absolutely.
cool.
Yep.
So what the other thing that is just like sort of mind-boggling for me about OData is the versioning. Um,
Yeah.
what is the deal with the OData version?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, if you're Googling it right now, you'll probably see two that come up quite a bit: OData V2 and V4, right? And you're probably thinking, why do I care about which one?
What happened to
OData,
three?
well, yeah, and then skips over three, right? Personally, I've never used three. I don't know very many applications that have used it. I think it kind of just skipped from two to four, but there's a three out there probably. But in the SAP side, SAP started with using the OData V2, and what we're talking about V2 and V4 is the versioning number of this OData standard protocol, right? V2 had a lot of great functionalities out of the box. Was SAP's first use of this protocol and all that. But with OData V4, there are more and more features that are coming out. More nested capabilities with your navigation routes. You can filter. I won't go too far down that path yet, but yeah. So so when you talk about those versioning of OData and all stuff, that's what we're talking about. Is this protocol that's been used. I think OData V4 was adopted in early 2010s. So
Mhm.
it's been around for a little while and it's still used today. So
Yeah. Okay. And so now in the SAP world, we see a lot of OData V2 and a lot of tools to generate OData V2 services, and we see a lot of OData V4 and a lot of tools to generate and consume OData V4 services. Um, there are differences, I guess I would say. So some tools can generate both V2 and V4 services, but sometimes with different capabilities. Some tools can consume V2 and V4 services, but sometimes with different capabilities. So like a really good example of that is Fiori Elements applications in SAP UI5 they were originally built on OData V2. Now they support OData V4, pretty much 100% compatibility, but there are a few missing features sometimes. We'll talk about a couple of those maybe.
yeah.
And then there are things that can generate OData, right? Like, so what, I
Mhm,
mean, you've used ABAP code base generation a lot.
mhm.
What's the difference between V2 and V4 from that in that environment?
Yep. Yeah, so if you're an SAP developer, when you build an OData V2 service, what you do is use a T called SEGW, and it's real. If you haven't used it before, it's a GUI interface. It's a lot of wizards. You can define your entities and the different tables you want to call and how they link and all that stuff through a graphical interface and all that stuff. With OData v4, at least in the early adoptions, right? They went away with the SCGW tool because of so much capabilities it has, and they went with what they called a code-based approach. which they give you a standard data provider class, which is where the data is really collected from, and what we call a model provider class, which is where how you define your service and all the entities that are inside of it, right? And from there, you build those two type of classes out to define the various entities in your service and call those out. So that's one of the big distinctions. So
Cool. So, and there are other tools for building services now in S/4HANA, of course, like especially newer versions. So
mhm,
since S/4HANA 2022, ABAP RAP,
yep,
the RESTful application programming model has really become prevalent, and ABAP RAP can generate either V2 or V4 services depending on what we tell it to do. And then the cloud application programming model, or CAP, is a Node.js or Java based, it has both flavors, framework for developing applications, model driven applications that create OData services. And that has been able to generate OData v4 services for quite some time as well. So we usually get OData v4 services out of CAP, although we have other options also. So lots of different options, lots of different
yep,
permutations.
yep. It's
So
important.
yeah, it's very interesting.
It's important to note that depending on where you are with your SAP landscape, right, where you're at, if you're thinking about, wow, I like this OData v4, I want to make the jump, look at the version that you're at. I know for the code-based approach, um, for me personally, I've gone far back as NetWeaver 7.5.0. Up to Service Pack 17. That had the model was really well defined at that point. It's pretty stable. In previous lives, we've used it there in other organizations that I've worked for. It's worked pretty well. So um, obviously, the newer the SAP system, the more capabilities you probably get and stuff. So
Mhm. So so Oda's got all these features, right? Like you define an OData service, and it's sort of like a set of tables, right? And then you can query those tables using all different, it's almost like a database, like a SQL call, right?
yeah,
You can tell it which
yep,
columns you want, you can tell it what rows you want by using filters. You can tell it it's got pagination and all that kinds of stuff. I mean, do you have to manually implement when you're doing this code-based approach, or even when you're using SEW, do you have to manually implement each of those features? I mean, are we talking like thousands of lines of code for one of these services?
yeah. So with the code-based approach, like as we mentioned earlier, there's two classes, right? There's the model provider class, which just defines the model, and the data provider class, right? So the features that we're talking about, the different query capabilities and stuff, you'll build that out when you redefine the different entities or the different methods called inside that data provider class. So as an example, a get call, right? You make a get to read data from your different tables, right? So a sales header, right? The pagination, like the server side pagination and all that stuff, that will be defined in that call. You'll write that once and be done. But when you build out your select, you'll build like a really dynamic select statement in your entity, and SAP, when you make that call, it will just call. So that filter condition gets processed through that framework, and it can be translated into a dynamic where clause in your select statement, as an example.
Oh,
So,
okay. So it gives you helpers, and it just gives you like
yep,
it gives you the where clause in a variable, and you put it into your select
you
statement, right?
exactly. Yep, you're not left completely stranded, like coming up with some crazy algorithm or something like that. There's a lot of great methods that are built inside the code base approach that will do just that
Mhm.
to help it along, or at least make your life a lot easier.
Yeah. So just to give people a flavor, like if you wanted to build just a simple query that read a sales order header table, right? I mean, how many lines of code are we talking there to implement the data provider class?
Oh, once you have the main definition. Like there's three types. There's the basic, intermediate, and advanced. Generally, basic implementations are the best way to go. We can talk about more of that in a second. But when you define those, you'll define the entities in each of those. So to answer your question directly, the main route, which is like the server side and all stuff, the stuff that you'll probably write only once because you just do the server pagination and that's it. That's just a couple lines of code. You do your entity call, the table read or something like that. That's a few lines of code. So you're looking at honestly 20 to 50 lines at most to build
Hmm.
it's just a quick get call really quick.
Yeah.
And
Okay. So
so,
pretty easy and
yep,
sort of templatized and repeatable,
it
right? So
is.
if you want to do the sales order line table, then it's like you just copy the code over and change a few things.
That's exactly it. Yep, it gets so much faster as you go on, right? Because it's just, wow, this is the same thing, just a different read on the table, and everything's dynamic that you can
Yeah.
put in. So just change it
Cool.
out. So
All right. Well, thank you
yeah.
for humoring my curiosity.
Oh
So
no.
let's talk about you've got some things you want to share because I think we've both seen that a lot of developers don't really use the features that are available for in these frameworks with OData in general. And honestly, that was one of the things I was getting at, that when developers do code-based implementations of these services, I've seen so many developers not use the helper features available and just do way more work than is actually necessary when implementing these types of services. So, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about OData
Yep.
and the OData features that people aren't aware of. So,
Yep.
what's on the top of your mind for OData?
Well, the first one,
Like number one feature.
the number one for me is e-tags. I don't know if anyone heard of them or what they are, but if you've never heard of an
Yeah.
e-tag, it's your way to control changes. All right, so let's walk through a case here, right? So Ethan, let's say you make a call, right? Get a sales order header information, right? You grab that information, you got your sales information, and then you decided, you had to make some changes to it, right? You say you want to change some partner information or something, like who your ship to is or something. But before you hit send, you went off to lunch. All right, you walked away. And then I come in, you don't know this, right? But I come in, I read the same sales order, and I want to change the partner information to something that maybe would be different than yours, and I make the change. Okay. This process is just fine, no problem there. You come back from lunch, you just hit send. Without e-tag, your changes will go through. Okay. So what that means is that you could be overwriting something that I might that's more important to, maybe I had the more recent updates that you didn't know or something, right?
Yeah.
But with e-tag support, it allows you to make sure that you have the latest edition that you have before you hit this change, that you know that when you make this change that you were the last person to read. So,
Mhm. And
yep,
it does that. I always forget about e-tags, but so e-tags work by when you do a read call, it provides back a string, an
yep,
e-tag, which is a string, and usually it's like a timestamp or something like that, like the last change timestamp on that record. And then when you send an update call with that record, you have to send an e-tag. And
yes,
if the e-tag that you send doesn't match the string that the backend knows is the current last change timestamp for that record, it will reject your update call and it will say that you don't have the most recent record. And then it's up to the front end application to figure out what to do with that. And UI5 has good features for dealing with that. But you need to request a new record and then reapply your changes and so on. So
exactly. Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, it throws back what we call a 412 precondition error. So we haven't talked about error messages yet in
All right.
with
That's too
REST.
complicated for me.
Yeah, no, we'll get to that. Yeah, we'll call that some other
But it's
time.
sort of,
But
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. But it's sort of like it's using e-tag switches you from a last update wins
yep,
scenario to a first update wins scenario. So you know that you're
exactly.
not going to unknowingly overwrite data in the back end.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Fantastic.
yeah,
So that's awesome.
yeah.
I don't think a lot of OData applications really use e-tags too much.
No, they don't. That I've noticed that quite a bit, and that
Yeah, yeah.
bites you really quickly in the yeah.
Yeah. And traditional
So
SAP developers aren't used to e-tags, right? Because traditional SAP developers are used to locks. So
yes,
in traditional SAP, when we are going to go into a screen in the SAP GUI and edit a record, we put a lock on that record. And you can see those locks in like SM12, right? And then when we're done with that record, we unlock the record. And so no one can actually change it when it's locked, theoretically. But in the new world, with the client server world, like we have to approach that differently. And the industry standard way to do that is e-tags, and OData, of course, being a RESTful protocol, supports e-tags.
yeah. With e-tag, just for another last change is probably it's my personal favorite. So if your record has a last change modified or something like that, that's the way to go. But let's say you're in a case, which I've seen this a lot in SAP tables, that there's not always a last change field. Another way that's commonly done is through hashing. So you could take
Okay.
your entire payload, wherever that, all your columns, and put it into this, what we call this hash string. And that would be like, it would track the changes that way. And we don't have to go down
Mhm.
that path, but that's another way of doing those E tags and how it checks too.
Yeah, another way to get a unique version, a
Unique.
unique, like short, unique identifier for what that
Yep.
record is currently.
Yep.
All right, e-tags, good one.
Yep.
What else? What else you got?
Yep. The other one is, and you've mentioned this a little bit ago. Another one that's kind of, I feel like it's forget is like your pagination. So what they call skip tokens.
Hmm.
This is the server side paging that we kind of mentioned a little bit ago. I don't see this actually happen a whole lot, developers using this either. But what that basically does is, as an example, you may make a call to your sales order header, and if you don't put any conditions on it, you may get back thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of records, right? And that can be very bogging to your system, right? That it can take a long time to load. You got people who don't know what to query, and they just overblow it up, right? So what the skip token does is that the server-side paging is that when you make your calls, so you filter and all stuff, let's say you get it down to like 100,000 records, right? It breaks it into chunks. So maybe it gets you back the first 50 records, the next 50, and the next 50. So what that does is if you think of it like a web page, you know how you have sometimes a table of results, or you scroll and then it keeps rebuilding as you keep going down. It's kind of like that. It keeps doing
Yep.
as you go to the next record, it gives you the next set. So you're not loading everything at once, because not everyone wants all 50 pages back, right? So
Right. So yeah, so developers who are building services need to implement skip and top to tell it how many, so you can tell it from the front end how many records to skip and how many records to give you. And then developers who are building front end applications need to use those features that are available on almost all OData services, um, so that they don't bog down the backend system, so the users aren't waiting around a lot, all that kind of stuff, right?
yep.
Cool. All right. I think that's a pretty
Have
easy one. Everybody should be
Yeah,
doing that, right?
they should
Um,
agree. It's best for
yeah.
performance, and yeah.
If you're a UFI developer, there's a lot of built-in there's a lot of sort of skip top stuff built in Fiori elements and in the auto expanding tables and lists. For example, it automatically does skip top. Um, Now, if you're a developer building a backend service, your responsibility is to make sure that you always return records in the same order, right?
Hmm.
So
Yes,
if you don't always return records in the same order across multiple queries, then you are going to then your pagination is not going to work correctly, because the system won't be able to figure out which sort of, well, it'll still give you pages, but it like could have a random assortment of records in it. So that is
exactly. Yep.
important. So there's you need to have a default ordering on your query.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good getcha right there. Got you there, Ethan. Yeah. Been guilty, we've
Yeah.
all been guilty there at some point, right? It's like, oh, quick, I'll just do this query. And then you
Yeah.
think about, why is record 4 position now in record 10? So,
Yeah. And the nice thing about AWAP is like OpenSQL does have generally has default ordering unless you do something weird. So it's usually okay, but never know.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. If you're trying to trust the records that are coming back and it's bouncing around on you, it's going to be hard to, like a bank statement, right? You want those records not to bounce around, right? Or something. But,
Yeah.
anyways.
Yeah, definitely. All right, cool. So e-tags, skip and top.
Yep.
What about like OData? If I'm using OData v4, what does that get me? What are
Yeah.
the cool
No. Yeah.
features of
So,
OData v4? Because what
yeah.
we've
So if
talked
you're
about
sitting,
so far, that's universal across v2 and v4, right?
yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So if you're on the fence, like I'm not hearing any pros or cons of switching to V4 or anything like that. I'm gonna give you one that I think is one of my personal favorites, and it's called cross-service navigation. So that came out. It's for SAP. It came out with V4. Let's walk through a case what the heck cross-service navigation is, right? So you'll have different services, right? You should be building like you have a sales order service that has all sales order related stuff. You probably have production orders, right? For your factory, you probably have maybe customer information, right? These are all different services. In OData V2, if you wanted to navigate from a sales order to a production order service, two different services, there's no way. You can't do it. You'd have to
So they
call
had
your
to,
results. Yeah. Yep.
yeah. So they would like put, they would, in order to V2, you would kind of build these application specific services, and you would like put every business object that you might need in that application into
Yep.
that service, and you would have the relationships between them, which like isn't really very scalable, right? So for
No.
a system the size of SAP with a number of business objects in the system, there would be no way to build an OData V2 service that kind of included everything where you could relate those things.
Exactly, and you can see really quickly how much of a nightmare that could be, right? You have a very complicated manufacturing line, right? Like all these different services you have, you would be your development object would be huge, right? With everything going on with all these calls, right?
That causes all
Um,
kinds of problems, even if you can support
it's
the huge service.
yeah.
Like, yeah. Okay. So OData
So
V4, you don't need to do that. So how does
yeah.
this work?
Yeah, so with OData V4, you can link these different services together, and they call them as service groups. So to give you an idea what a grouping is, for example, you may have a need for an order management group, okay, which means that maybe you have external customers that want to read your information. Maybe Ethan, you want to check on your order or something like that, your own sales order, and get your information and stuff. But we don't necessarily want you to have access to production orders, right? We don't want, that's not your information, right? But internally, it may be the other way around. Maybe internally, we want another group that says for internal services, right? So still probably want to call sales orders. You obviously want to call production orders. With service groups, you can build one service and recycle that service in different groups. And that makes it really nice later on. Whereas in OData V2, if you either call it multiple times or you'd be calling like rebuilding entities in each service to do that, right? That gets really messy, right? For
Right.
consistency.
Yeah. And
Um,
you can import entities from another service into an OData V2
yep.
service like an SCGW and stuff, but it's not really you're not reusing it. You're kind of just reusing the definition and then you pull the implementation over. So it's like copy paste instead of
Yeah.
actual reuse.
Yep.
Um, okay.
Yep.
So
So yeah.
so how does that end up working? Like what does that even look like in a query?
Yeah. So so from a consumer point of view, right? It doesn't really look a whole lot different. So when you call a REST your OData service, right? So let's say you want to go sales order to production order, right? It's still a navigation route that you use expand, right? Expand call, and you'll navigate to it. It's a link that's built there. On the back side, for us developers, in your model provider class, remember we talked about that a little bit ago, there is a service definition that you'll put in, and you'll tell it that this sales order service can link to this production service and whatever services it can be at. And then you can then in a transaction to administer the V4 service, you can group together the services that are together. So
Okay. So it's really easy to kind of compose services into a
yep.
service group. And then from the perspective of for the perspective of the application using that service, the service group just kind of looks like a service. And then
Yeah.
you can
Yep.
call the different entity sets within it, and you can, and if the service group has defined associations, which I guess maybe we should talk about, if the service group has defined associations between those entities, like foreign key relationships, then those will be available to the application calling it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. Does the service group generate its own metadata file?
It does not. So that's important. If you have a service group called order management, you would have to know all the services that are inside that's available. So that's one of
Okay,
the downsides.
interesting.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I forget what the name of it is, but SAP recently came out with this project to basically provide a. It's not a standard, but they're bringing it to standards bodies, but basically provide like a service registry, so like a sort of cross-service metadata document in some sense, that would allow you to more easily discover all the services like in an SAP system, or across a bunch of SAP systems even. So maybe that's like kind of the longer term solution for that whole shared metadata document thing. But yeah.
Exactly. That'd be fantastic because right now, going back to our documentation that we talked about earlier, that'd be kind of hard to find out that I'm in granted this order management service group. I don't know what that means. I mean, I can't see those services that are available. So,
Mhm.
just an FYI, if you did call a navigation route and you didn't have, let's say that production order, and you don't have access to it, it will just return back no results. It would throw back.
Mhm.
So,
Oh,
um,
interesting.
yep.
Yeah. That's very SAP. So, in back in the SAP GUI, like if you do a query on something you don't have access to, you might have access to the table, but like you don't have access to the internal, to the contained results or something like that. You just don't get anything. It's
Yeah.
like this
Yep.
table's empty.
Yeah.
And that happens all the time with CDS views. It can be very,
Yes.
very confusing when you run a CDS view and you don't get any results back. And I know there's stuff in here, but
Yeah.
why
Wait a
am
minute
I
here.
not seeing results? And it's like, well, you don't have access, and
Yep.
that's how it works. Okay, yeah. So that can be very nice from a application building perspective, though, because you don't have to worry too much about access and authorizations and stuff like that. You can let the backend service handle it. And it'll look at the user running the application, making the service call, and it'll give them what they're allowed to see.
Yeah. Yep.
That's pretty cool. Okay, great.
If you're
Well,
not using
that
it,
was
my
some
little
good
plug,
ones.
use it.
Yeah. Can we talk about one of my favorite sort of unknown
Sure.
features of OData, which is
Yeah.
aggregation? Um,
Oh, yeah. Great topic.
and this one's fraught because um, it's I know about it from OData v2, and SAP pretty fully supports the aggregation concept in OData v2. And most people don't know that, which is always very surprising to me. So, well, it's not that surprising. It's sort of hidden. But a lot of
Yeah.
OData services, and you can tell by looking at the metadata and seeing if there are things that are defined as key figures and dimensions. But a lot of OData services actually support aggregation. And what that means is that, like, to go back to your example, if I've got like a sales order header table and or service, and that service includes like a total value of the sales order as a field, so a total dollar value, then I can do if the service has been built in the correct way, and generally speaking, SAP services are, I can do aggregation there. So yes, I can just get a list of sales orders, right? And I
Yep.
can look at that field and I can say, all right, I've got all the numbers and I can add them up and I can come up with across these 1,000 sales orders, what's the total value? Well, what if I want to do a query that is say like I want to know about my total sales value in 2023 year to date or just 2022 total, right? Well, that's going to be a lot of sales orders probably. I mean, if I'm like most big companies, it's probably many, many, many thousands, possibly millions of sales orders that I aggregate. So I need to download all of those sales orders and then I need to add up all those numbers. And that's just not going to be very fast, right? So what I see sometimes in the SAP world, especially the sort of extension, people building extensions and customizations, is they'll define another entity set or even another whole service to come up with the aggregate sales order number, right?
Yep.
And that's not necessary because
Yeah.
what you can do with OData v2 is OData has a select statement as an argument, and what that select statement does is it tells you which columns to return. Um, and so you can make a query to that sales order header service, and you can say, just give me the year and the value of the sales order as the two columns. And you would expect, like in a normal service, what you would get back would be you would get back that 100,000 long list of
Is-
sales orders, and it would just have two columns. So it would be much, much smaller, it would be much faster, it would be much easier to deal with on the front end. But in the service that aggregates, what you actually get back is you get back one record for every unique value in the sort of dimension columns that you've specified. So in that query, I've only specified the year as a dimension column, and then the value is what's called a key figure column. So I would get back one record for every year, and the key figure value would be the aggregate value for that year. Now there are complexities here with currencies and stuff like that. What you really have to do is ask for the year and the currency, or you need to do some currency conversion. But a lot of SAP services will just do that for you. So which gives you a huge amount of flexibility on the front end to get the data you really need from that backend service, and all that gets pushed down to the database, to HANA or whatever database is being used. So it's a pretty fast operation.
Wow. So that sounds pretty fantastic. I mean, think about a case where I'm a manager and I just need to pull out some numbers. I don't have to have a whole I don't have to rewrite a whole, entity or something like that or something custom. I can
Yeah.
use this aggregate function to get back. I need a quick number on my total sales. That's fantastic. Wow.
Yep. So it just gets pushed down to a group by in the open SQL or SQL statement, and it's all handled. So that's awesome. I love that
Yeah.
about OData
Oh
V2.
yeah.
I think it's used in a lot of SAP's applications, but it's not that well known among developers. So I think people should be aware of it. Now, what about OData V4, Nick? Does it have
Yeah.
aggregation?
Um, I didn't see a whole lot of support for it. I mean, I'm one of those developers that have not utilized a whole lot of those features yet myself. Obviously it's fantastic. We should be, right? I totally agree with Ethan on that. But yeah, my understanding is that it's not very much there yet, at least on the code-based approach side, to do that. So, I know
Mhm.
SAP keeps trying to improve the RESTful application model. They've been, like you said, in 2022, they're starting to support OData v4. So who knows? Very soon, right?
Yeah, I think it's something to kind of keep an eye on.
Hmm.
So what I would say is that it is coming. So SAP's made some announcements, I think relatively recently, that it's on the roadmap for CAP services, and I believe it's on the roadmap for RAP services as well. I think a version of it may already be there in a couple of those for OData v4. So that's awesome because it was actually
Hmm.
kind of holding back the ability to move to OData v4 for a lot of for a good chunk of applications that really needed that. Um, so I'm really, really looking forward to having that in OData v4. There is a standard, there has been for a long time. I
Hmm.
think it is, I think there may be some updates coming to it because it may not have been exactly what was needed. Um, but yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah.
What else
And
in oh, go ahead,
well,
sorry.
I was gonna kind of a small segment off of that actually a little bit is talking about the OData v4 standard. So as a whole, because if you go out and Google OData v4, you're going to get a lot of capabilities that a lot of languages can use, right? There's some advanced nesting capabilities that you can do, some
Yep.
weird clauses based on nested
Yeah, we should
structures.
talk about some of those nesting capabilities. But
Exactly.
yeah.
Yep. And what we'll find out is that in SAP, they using the OData v4 standard, but a lot of the functionality that you see, like you look out there from Oasis or wherever, it's not quite there yet. One example being, um, you do a where used, maybe on a nested condition where it's like, okay, I'm on the sales order header. Here's all my sales order items. Give me those sales order items, customers that equal this, right? That
Hmm.
that's not really available. Those complex searches aren't there yet. So just
Hmm.
some examples. Be careful when you're going out there trying to query and you're getting back weird results. Some of that stuff's just not
Yeah,
there
yeah.
yet.
Well, like we were talking about at the beginning, like there's going to be a difference between the different implementation methods,
Yep.
right? So that actually is supported, or a version of that is supported with RAP OData v4 services, which is great.
Perfect.
So
Yep.
you can do a query. So you can do a query on the sales order header uh, entity set with an association to sales order items, where you say, give me all the sales orders that have at least one item with X material group, right? Or something
Yep.
like that. You can
Yep.
make that query with RAP, with the RESTful application programming model. So that's awesome. You can use the sort of there are two sort of quantifiers, any or all slash none. So give me sales order headers where all of the items have this property, or where one of the items has this property, or where none of the items has this property. So that's that's a super powerful
Hmm.
feature that people have been starving for in Node V2, and it's just not there. Never going to
Yeah.
happen.
No.
Not possible.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I
okay,
agree. I hope that, like I said, as more releases come out, hopefully they'll continue to implement more of the OData v4 standard into SAP services. So,
yeah, there's a lot there, and SEB has done a lot of work implementing a big chunk of it, and I think continues to. So that's pretty cool. Um, Anything else that is kind of on your mind that you wanted to share or talk
yeah.
about?
I think it's a good time to talk about, I mean, some things I've learned, some good practices or something like that, I don't know, I
Yeah,
think it might be helpful for developers. I will put a little footnote right now. This is my experience and my take on it. I would love to always hear thoughts about others. So, or Ethan, maybe you can, obviously, let me know too. So
I'll tell you
we've
if I
talked about,
disagree. Go for
yeah,
it.
yeah, it's okay. But thumbs down, thumbs up, whatever. So we've talked about services, right? And if you're new to building web services and use, these OData, using this OData standard, you're probably thinking about how do I even know where to start? Where can I go with, right? What's the right way to go? We've talked about a service is really a collection of entities, right? Just kind of go back there. So when you think about a sales order, right? Sales order has a header and it has items. It has maybe some like production order information, all that stuff. I mean, your first thought probably is, well, I wanted to put everything in a one type of service. And it goes back to kind of developer basics a little bit there that just think about the reusability of that, right? Well, production orders can be used as its own entity. They have their own criteria. So those should be separate services, right? Um, the other thing I would love to make note on too is naming. We're used to as the SAP developers, we love there's a German acronym, so like sales order header number is VBELN, right? Well,
Mhm.
remember that these services are exposed to other humans typically, right? You're reading this, so VBELN is not going to make sense to anyone else if you're not an SAP developer. So use human readable names. I can't stress that, um, and
Yeah,
be consistent too. If you
yeah.
call it in your organization, you decided that sales order number is what the ID is for your sales header, call it consistently with all your services. I mean, some of the stuff that I'm mentioning is really kind of like good clean code stuff that you hear about, right? That you should be doing
Mhm.
and stuff. So, I mean, it shouldn't be too new. Um,
Yeah, and that buys you that actually buys you something. I mean, it certainly buys you maintainability and coherency across all of your code base, but there are also consuming applications that sometimes depend on this. So, for example, if you're using the Fiori Elements overview page, that's a page that is sort of like a dashboard, and it's got a bunch of cards on it that show different it's intended to show an overview of a business process. And so you've got a bunch of charts and lists and stuff like that all on this one page. And those cards are usually populated from several different services. The overview page has a functionality in UI5 to define a bunch of different services in it that it can call, and then which ones are linked up to which card. Um, Overview pages in UI5 also have a filtering mechanism so that at the top of the page, above all the cards, you can say, I only want to see this information, the sales dashboard information for this company code, or this sales area, I should say, or I want to see it for this customer. Um, and what it does is, well, how does it know how to apply that filter to all of those different service calls? Well, its assumption is that every one of those service calls will have a sales area column and a customer column, and that those columns will all have exactly the same name. So it will be exactly sales area or exactly customer, and it will generate a filter that it applies to every one of those services. If one of your services has a different name for the customer, the filter will not get applied to it. And therefore, you will not really be able to use that service appropriately in an overview page. So if you're following this clean code practice that you're talking about, Nick, you're good to go. If you're sloppy and you're not using like consistent casing and consistent spelling and consistent ways of talking about business entities in your services, it's not going to work. So not only will everybody be confused trying to consume your services, but and those of us who are a little obsessive will be very upset. But it also just won't work with certain technical frameworks. So something to keep in mind. What is the sort of casing, the sort of conventional casing for these types of like service names and entities and stuff like that?
yeah, I believe it's, oh, how do I get this wrong? Pascal casing. So where like the first letter of each of the words are capitalized. So if you have sales document number, you'll be capital S in your sales, document would be
Hmm.
capital D, number would be N.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean that's what I've seen too. We'll have to get back to everybody on what it's called. I think Pascal is probably right.
I can't remember. Yeah,
I can never remember if it's
Google that.
Pascal or Snake Case or Camel Case. Like I'm pretty sure
Yeah,
Camel Case is the one that has the lowercase first letter, and then everything else is
I that's correct because I
capitalized
remember
letters.
that being the I hate to say it, like the little, how camel has a little hump in the middle. That's kind of how I think about it when I
Yeah.
see camel case. Yeah. So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and snake. Oh, yeah. I'm googling now. Snake casing is the underscore. So so it must be
That's
Pascal casing. I don't think I
okay.
heard that
Whew.
before. Yeah,
So I've been
yeah.
bit so many times
Generally
over the
speaking,
years.
we
I've
don't
called it camel.
use. Yeah, but generally speaking, we don't use camel case, and we don't use underscores between words.
No.
Generally
Yep.
speaking, we use that approach where every word is capitalized, acronyms are fully capitalized, and everything
Yep.
else is lowercase. So,
Correct.
and
Yep.
that the property or the entity name always starts with an uppercase letter.
Yep.
Um, okay, cool. Even if it's like an old Apple product name, like an iPod,
Yeah.
you still have to uppercase it. Sorry, Apple.
Yeah. Um, naming on navigation routes, I've seen it done two different ways, and I'm curious, Ethan, if what you've seen too. One is either having it start with so your navigation route. So just really quick, sales order header navigates to a sales item, right? So when you
Yeah.
navigate, there's a substructure you have, and the naming of that can be. So I've seen it as one way is underscore and then the name of it. So underscore sales item or
Okay.
sales
Hmm.
items,
Hmm.
or it says two underscore like the word two to, and then the name
Yeah.
of this of the set. So
And
um,
the two is lowercase that I've seen.
that is correct. So
Yeah.
it breaks kind of our thing we just mentioned a second ago too. So I've seen it
It
both
it
ways
makes them
there.
look a
That's
lot different. Yeah.
it does. But
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. I've seen both of those as well. It's not framework defined, I guess I would say. It's
no,
developer defined. And I don't know that there's really a sort of best practice for that. I like what I've seen actually in CAP a fair amount is that those navigation entities look exactly the same as a regular property. So it'll just be called items, capital I. I kind of like that, honestly, but
yeah,
I've seen it done a bunch of different ways. I don't think there's a lot of consistency.
yeah. I agree. I've seen it done that way too. And I think it goes right back to what we mentioned earlier, right? Just be consistent across your organization. So if you do, like you said, just call it items or something like that, or call
Good
something that,
luck.
just stay consistent. Yeah.
Good luck. Good luck.
Yeah. Be an
Cool.
enforcer for your company.
Awesome. Well, those are great recommendations. Anything else you had in your mind? One last closing idea here.
No, I think that pretty much
That's
covers
it.
Yeah.
We've we've covered everything there is to know about
Everything.
OData best
Yeah.
practices and hidden features. No, there's a lot more there. There's a
Absolutely.
bunch I think we probably don't know about. But yeah, I mean, it's great to chat today and talk a little bit about that
Absolutely.
topic. I think it's always cool to hear what people who are really into it, enthusiastic about it, like you have to share about topics like OData and what we can learn about it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ethan, for the conversation, the time today.